Hello, my favorite listener, and welcome back to The Engine of War, a story of steam, spark, and the question of morality, told in 22 episodes every other Tuesday here by Rust Belt Studios. You can find 2 other shows by Rust Belt Studio, Mikey and the Garden Arch, on the Tuesday that Engine doesn't occupy. That's a high fantasy hero quest with a 12-year-old protagonist in a world of whimsy and wonder. Or Into the Dark of the Woods, a folklore-heavy Midwestern story told in 5 beats, set in northern Michigan. Now, since you're here for Engine, settle in. The show is about to start. The bell that woke the new day watch was a dull iron sound that seemed to roll out of the city wall itself. It found Kael sitting up on his cot already, hands on his knees, listening for the ache in his chest the way a smith listens for a crack in the anvil. The ache was there, honest and faint, and underneath it the calm thrum of a gift not yet drawn. The dormitory smelled of lye soap, old wool, and boys who burned themselves into men by degrees. Jorran snored on the next rack over, mouth open, one arm flung over his face as if he'd thrown a punch in his sleep and forgotten to pull it back. At the third toll, he jerked upright and grinned without looking at anyone. "Morning, Mercy. Who wants to race?" No one answered. Kael laced his boots and stood, and Jorran's grin sharpened when it failed to cut him. They found the docents posted like crows along the bench rail, dispersing assignments with neat strokes of pen and a stingy economy of words. Docent Malin's robe hung straight as a rule. His left hand shook barely, until he set 2 slips on the plank and stilled it by force. "Kael, Jorran. Timber Camp 14. The overseer requested 2 hands. Small accident yesterday, large stupidity always. Go put both to rights." Jorran flicked the edge of the paper. "You're sending both boy gods? What'd the trees do, docent?" Malin did not blink. "The trees were cut, as they always are. Men were under them, as they unfortunately are. Bring back more than you burn. Report on return." "Yes, docent." Jorran didn't respond, but he did salute with 2 fingers and a grin that suggested he'd already won a contest not yet named. They turned toward the gatehouse with the slips tucked under their robe pockets like knives. The gatehouse was a sawtooth bite chewed into the city's red brick, gears racked like teeth behind thick iron grills. Guards leaned on shock rods and pretended to be bored. The rods hummed low under their palms like cats that only liked one person. 2 chain-drive carts waited in the yard, boilers ticking, breathing steam through little whistling nostrils. The drivers wore their goggles up like second foreheads. "Guild," the sergeant said, not bothering to make it a compliment or an insult. "Up you get. We've got a half day out if the roads hold, and the wilds have been soggy. Last week's rain took the culvert." Jorran bounced into the front car with the easy strength of a man who had never yet paid interest on his debts. Kael climbed up more carefully, setting his bench kit near his knees, checking the simple glass reservoir by habit, even though it measured temper, not supply. The cart coughed twice, spat steam, and churned forward when the driver engaged the chain. Copper spires slid behind them at a clanking pace. Brick and copper and soot, silhouettes of gear houses against a brightening sky. The wall swallowed them a few minutes later, the gears in its belly biting and releasing as if the city were an animal remembering how to breathe out. Beyond the last buttress, the world turned open and uneven. The road threw its long brown ribbon across fields gone to stubble, then into scrub, and then to trees so old their bark seemed armored. The line between city and wilds had never been a clean seam. You just knew it when the air tasted different. "Smell that?" "Green. That's useless on a ledger." The wilds feed the city, Timber and ore and water always have, and the spark keeps the wilds going, Kael said by rote. Till the timber gets ideas and stands itself back up. Here the bots already are getting those types of ideas. Jorran shrugged it off and turned his smile on Kael like a lantern. First man to 5 then. No little cuts, full mends. Kael watched the trees move past. We are not counting men as points. Then call it practice. No one likes a sermon on the back of a cart. 40 miles later, the first practice presented itself in the form of a wagon axle split like old bread. 3 wildlings were trying to brace it with saplings in the thin application of hope. The guards would have rolled past. Their carts had a schedule, and schedules meant ore and timber back in the city on time. The sergeant raised a hand anyway because guild on a bench meant the rules flexed. Jorran hopped out before the cart had even stopped moving. He planted his palm on the copper cradle built into the wagon's rail, threw the lens down like a gauntlet, and drew hard enough that the air around his shoulders hissed. Ozone. Ash. Rain. The brake learned to be wood again with a rough clunk, and the wildlings stepped back. One, a boy with a scar along his jaw like a second bad smile, stared at Jorran the way a hungry dog stares at hands. Next time, check your load, Jorran said brightly and jogged back to the cart with heat on his face and pride in his stride. Kael didn't say anything. He did what he always did, the quiet inventory of himself after another man's draw, the careful math of what that smell meant when it clung that much on a road with hours of work ahead. They passed a line of women with baskets full of tiny, dull green cones, resin for the city's lamps. They passed a string of boys pushing a chain-driven saw on rails that didn't reach as far as they were supposed to yet. They passed a church that had lost its roof and found a pulley, a square weathered block with a bell hung under the eaves to call crews back for stew. Men looked up as the carts went by and then looked down again as if afraid their gaze would be taxed. When did we decide the wilds were ours? One of the younger guards asked no one in particular. When we built the walls, the sergeant said. When we named them, the driver offered. When we paid to ship the logs, another said, which was the answer that always ended the argument. By noon, the road bent along a creek that had sawdust in its shoulders and a low music in its stones. Smoke smudged the sky a turn farther on. Timber Camp 14 sprawled across the base of a hill like a man with his boots off, rough, temporary, tired. Saw pits stood in a row like graves. A chain derrick creaked, lifting striped trunks on and off the gear wagons. The cabins were crude boxes hammered together out of what the cutting left over. Someone had tried to raise a little shrine on a stump with a chunk of an iron gear for a saint. The gear had rusted. The overseer was city-born, you could tell before he opened his mouth by the way his coat tried to be clean in a place that wouldn't allow it. He had a tally slate and a voice that cracked like old varnish. Took your time. We got 3 men with bad hands, one with a tree kiss to the shoulder, and a boy who doesn't know he broke his ribs yet. And the West pulley stutter tripping my crews. If it goes, we lose a day. Men first. Kael said it not sharp, just fact. The overseer snorted as if he'd been expecting the sentence and had a counter ready, but he didn't use it. He just gestured. The hurt lay in the shade behind the cookhouse, not on cots, but on whatever had been handy. A door off its hinges, a coil of rope, a stack of split rails. The wildlings watched Kael and Jorran come like they watched the weather. Hands. Jorran said it and then knelt with a flourish that would have looked cheap if the work that came after it had. He took a smashed ring finger and persuaded it back into a shape that would hold a cup again. He healed a palm that had learned the wrong lesson about where to be. He fixed the boy's rib with a flash that made 3 men across the yard look up instinctively for lightning. Ozone. Ash. Rain. The smell lived in the tented space for a long beat. Jorran grinned at the guards, and the guards grinned back like men watching a knife thrower who hadn't hit anyone yet today. Kael took the shoulder. The joint had wrenched, torn, and tried to become something new out of fear and pain. He set his palm, touched the coil, and let himself out with the patience of a man feeding thread through a needle. Ozone. Ash. Rain. The joint eased. The muscle learned to lie down, and the man's breath unwound from the knot it had been trying to die in. Kael broke spark before he broke touch, and the man looked at him with the flat gratitude of someone who didn't have room for miracles between work and sleep. "Pulley," the overseer said immediately, scratching a mark on his slate as if to make the order official. "Men first." Kael said it again, this a protest now. "There are two of you, aren't there? One can polish hands while the other fixes my pulley." "If your pulley stutters, you send a mechanic," Jorran said lightly, rubbing his own sternum with 3 fingers like a man absently scratching a good itch. "We're healers." "You're sparkers," the overseer said. "And that pulley doesn't run, these hands you're kissing won't have work to come back to." The sergeant, the only city man out here aside from the overseer and the guild with any authority, looked at Kael with a weight in his face like a test. It wasn't command. It was the expectant gravity of a man who wanted the day to just go simple. Kael nodded once, not to the overseer, not to the sergeant, but to the reality of a camp that hung on ropes and the men under them. "I'll take a look." He left Jorran and walked the yard to the west derrick. The black chain looped up and over a high wheel half the size of a cottage door. Sap bled thick from the rack of stripped logs, making the iron slick. The gear housing to the left of the wheel had been patched with leather and hope. It ticked in a way that said tired, not wrong. The man working the machine turned and said, "You don't look like a mechanic." "That's because I'm not," Kael said quietly. "But I can smooth a stutter." He put the heel of his hand to the housing. He did not draw, not yet. He listened for that little spiteful rhythm. Click, drag, click. The sound an old iron heart makes when it wants to stumble. It was there. He could teach it better, the way he had taught the bellows to breathe with a finger's worth of himself in the hall. Jorran watched him from across the yard. "You're just smoothing. You're not animating a gear." The word animating hung between them like a bright toy they were pretending not to want. To spark a machine and have it hold the spark. To wake a thing past tool and into life. That was the boy story told before sleep to every child with a gift. Professors smiled like men who had once stood in the hallway of that story. Docents spoke of it as a dream to keep for later, far later, when a man had earned enough scars to spend one more. Machines, the ones that had green eyes and voices, noted names in their slow ledgers and turned their green gaze with something like respect when one of those rare men passed. They were called animists by the crews and saints by poets, and something else, quiet and practical, by the machines. Givers. Jorran would make a story out of it if he could, and Kael didn't want a story. He wanted a smoother day that didn't cost him tomorrow. He focused on his flat palm, he found that rhythm again, and he let the tiniest line of himself slide along the iron's memory. Ozone. Ash. Rain. The tick evened, and the chain lifted and fell without the little foxtrot of catching and letting go. The man working the machine laughed under his breath, once, because he could appreciate a trick even if he didn't understand it. Kael closed the valve he'd opened inside himself and felt the bell in his chest answer with approval and warning in equal parts. "You see? Sparks can mend more than skin." Kael looked at the overseer flatly. "We polish edges. Don't ask us to cut." "Cutting's why we got saws." The wildlings watched Kael and Jorran with the side eyes of men looking at fire through slats. A woman with a scarf tied over her hair held up a little girl to see the pulley work smooth. The girl clapped once, twice, as if someone had made a coin jump between fingers. The mother whispered hush and didn't hide that it was all. It wasn't all for the guild. It was all for the miracle of a day not breaking. First to 5, Jorran reminded Kael mildly as he came back over, counting in his head because he liked to have numbers to go with grins men gave him. First to all home, Kael said, and Jorran rolled his eyes the way that said, "Fine, Saint, be that way." They spent the afternoon doing what the guild always did when it ventured past brick. They patched, they soothed, they smoothed. Kael took a crushed toe and slid the bones back into their plan. Jorran took a gash that had the shape of a sawtooth and asked the skin to remember it was not a door. Ozone. Ash. Rain. The scent braided with a sap-sweet smoke and the sour of men who had worn the same shirt 3 days in a row. Every draw made Kael lighter. Every draw made Jorran brighter. The guards let their shock rods rest on their shoulders and told stories about fights they hadn't been in. Late light slanted across the camp when the sergeant found them again. He stood with his hands hooked under his belt, not looking left or right. "Overseer says your hands were worth the trip. He also says to mind the big saw at the south line. She's been sulking." "Machines sulk now?" Jorran asked. "Good. Something to scold that isn't a docent." "They sulk when men lash them like horses," the sergeant said, not unkindly. "You can talk to iron all you like, Sparker, just don't expect it to apologize." Kael glanced toward the south line, and he could see the saw carriage between the trunks, a squat iron beast with 2 blades mounted like tusks and a chimney on its back. A crew of 4 wildlings fed it trunks. A man with an overseer's coat shouted over the blade's rattle. The machine exhausted smoke in a steady rhythm. "Tomorrow," the sergeant added, reading the calculation on Kael's face, "lights going. No one wants to fetch you out of the stump yard in the dark." "I'll sleep, and in the morning I can fix that sulk." The sergeant snorted. "I've never met a guild boy heavy enough to need a litter," he said, and walked away to shout at a man off a log that looked like it might roll if the wind blew. Kael let out a breath he hadn't noticed he'd been keeping shallow, and he looked down at his hands. Sap had dried in the creases. He rubbed his thumb along his ring finger as if the burr he'd smoothed last night on the coil had found its way back to his skin. "Dream of it?" Jorran asked too softly for anyone else, watching the south line where iron breathed and men obeyed. He didn't mean the sulk, he meant the old story. "Of giving it? Of making one wake?" Kael looked at him and didn't look at all, because there are answers you don't put into the air. Finally, he acquiesced. "Sometimes." Jorran grinned, but there was something naked in it for a half-breath. "I'll do it first. You can scold me after and tell me that I did it wrong." Kael smiled at that, small, but without teeth. "And I'll mend you afterward." And Jorran's laughter after that comment was both honest and relieved. Night came down the hill and pooled in the saw pits. The cookhouse bell clanged a clumsy hand to supper. Men put down tools with the violence of men who have learned not to be gentle with anything they mean to see again in the morning. The smell of stewed beans, old pork, and river water took up the air. Kael ate with the guards because that was where men like him were placed. Jorran told a story about a professor who could light a pipe across the room by looking at it too sternly. The guards laughed, but the wildlings kept their heads down and their spoons busy. When Kael stepped out of the tent afterward, the world between the trees had gone black. The south line's big saw muttered once in its sleep and then fell silent. Somewhere an owl tried out a wrong note and then corrected itself. The stars showed in tatters between the crowns of trees. Copper Spire's spoke never got out this far, and it felt like someone had laid a map of other possibilities over the world he knew and let him see through 2 layers at once. "Tomorrow, we'll smooth the sulk, we'll patch the stupid, and we'll count to 5. Kael just smiled. Tomorrow. He didn't know yet that tomorrow would put a blade in a machine's hand and a new question on his tongue, the kind that changes the shape of a life. He only knew the ache in his chest and the old refrain inside the ache, the one the guild had named and not named in 100 treatises. Ozone, ash, and rain. He breathed it in and let it go. The night breathed with him. The city never said please, and the wilds never said no. Between them walked a boy with a coil of copper and a careful hand, and another who had already found the edge of his light and liked the way it stung. Hello again. That concludes Engine of War Episode 2, The Wilds. You get to see a little bit more of the world that we're creating here together, and I'm so glad that you could make it. Engine of War is a Rust Belt Studio production, and this episode was written and narrated by Bryan Foster. You can catch this show every other Tuesday, where you found it this time, and anywhere else that podcasts are readily available. Rust Belt Studio also brings you 2 other shows, Mikey and the Garden Arch, as well as Into the Dark of the Woods. Mikey is on the opposite Tuesday of Engine. Into the Dark of the Woods runs on Fridays. Listens go a long way to helping the studio grow, as well as liking and sharing. Those 2 things are hard to measure but are pivotal to our growth. You also can support the studio via the Acast supporter feature, or you can join our Patreon, and the link is in the show notes below. At just $2 a month, you'll get into the Grip tier, where you can get this and every other episode that we do a day early and ad-free. $5 will move you to the Projectionist tier, where you'll get extras, one-offs, and other things that we do that go right to Patreon. At $9, you'll become a studio executive and can help shape the course of future episodes or future projects that we work on. In any case, thank you for being here, and until next time, my favorite listener.